The scream that tore through Richmond General's emergency room at 2:47 a.m. wasn't coming from a patient. It was Nurse Jessica Martinez, a 15-year veteran who'd seen everything from gunshot wounds to overdoses, stumbling backward from bed 7 with her hand clamped over her mouth. Dr. Robert Hendricks, who'd been practicing emergency medicine for 47 years, set down his coffee with trembling fingers. In the harsh, fluorescent light, what they'd uncovered beneath the bandages on Sarah Mitchell's neck defied every textbook he'd ever studied. "Get Dr. Chen on the phone," he whispered to the night supervisor, his voice barely audible above the monitors. "And call the CDC, now." Sarah Mitchell, 62 years old, former high school English teacher from Shenandoah Valley, lay unconscious as 3 decades of buried secrets literally surfaced on her skin. But to understand how a simple rash had led to this moment of medical horror, we need to go back 6 months to a quiet Sunday morning when everything still seemed normal. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that 62 was too young to feel old, but standing in the kitchen of the 2-story colonial that James had built with his own hands in 1975, she felt every one of those years settling into her bones. The morning sun streamed through the gingham curtains she'd sewn during their first year of marriage, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The house still smelled like James, Old Spice aftershave and the Lucky Strike cigarettes he'd never quite managed to quit, even after the VA doctors told him his lungs were already compromised from whatever he'd breathed in those Vietnamese jungles. 3 years since the funeral, and Sarah still set 2 coffee cups on the counter each morning out of habit. Shenandoah Valley stretched beyond her kitchen window, rolling green hills that had witnessed 2 centuries of American stories. This was conservative country, where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone died, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. The kind of place where a woman like Sarah, a retired English teacher who'd spent 38 years drilling grammar into reluctant teenagers, was expected to fade quietly into widowhood. But Sarah had never been good at fading quietly. Her daughter Margaret, whom everyone called Maggie, worked as an emergency room doctor in Richmond 2 hours away, but might as well have been 2,000 miles for how often they spoke these days. The distance between them had started with James's death and grown wider with each difficult conversation about Sarah's stubborn independence and Maggie's conviction that her mother couldn't possibly manage alone in the big house. Ruth Williams, 89 years old and sharp as the day she'd served as a Navy nurse in World War II, lived in the blue cottage next door. Ruth had been the one to hold Sarah's hand during James's final months, when the Agent Orange complications ravaged his body and the VA bureaucracy shuffled his claims from office to office until he was too weak to fight anymore. Dr. Robert Chen ran the family practice clinic downtown, a kind man in his mid-40s who'd taken over from old Doc Patterson when arthritis finally forced the elderly physician to retire. Dr. Chen had been good to James, patient with his war stories and gentle with his questions about symptoms that seemed to multiply faster than anyone could treat them. The community was still reeling from the ongoing lawsuits against the government, dozens of local families seeking compensation for Agent Orange exposure. James had refused to join the class action, too proud to admit that his country might have poisoned him, too loyal to believe that the same government he'd served with honor could have knowingly sent him into chemical hell. Sarah poured her single cup of coffee and walked to the window, watching Ruth tend her victory garden with the same methodical precision she'd once used to tend wounded soldiers. Some battles, Sarah thought, never really end. The first time Sarah noticed the rash, she was getting ready for Sunday service at Calvary Baptist, the same white-steepled church where she and James had been married 41 years ago. She was fastening the pearl necklace he'd given her for their 25th anniversary when her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there, a rough, slightly raised patch of skin just below her hairline, hidden where the collar of her blouse would cover it. Probably just dry skin, she murmured to her reflection, applying a dab of moisturizer. At 62, her body seemed to develop new complaints weekly: creaky knees that predicted rain better than the weather service, reading glasses that migrated around the house like rebellious pets, and skin that had grown temperamental about everything from laundry detergent to the metal clasps on her jewelry. But Ruth Williams had eyes like a hawk, honed by 7 decades of medical training that started in field hospitals and never really ended. After service, as they stood in the church parking lot discussing Pastor Henderson's sermon about patience in tribulation, Ruth's gaze fixed on Sarah's neck with the intensity of a woman who'd seen too much suffering to ignore warning signs. "Honey," Ruth said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd once held dying soldiers in her arms, "that doesn't look like any rash I've seen in 70 years of nursing." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her collar, pulling it higher. "It's nothing, Ruth. Just irritation from this old necklace, probably." But Ruth stepped closer, her weathered hands gentle as she lifted Sarah's chin to get a better look. The rash was roughly the size of a quarter, with an angry red center surrounded by skin that looked almost purple in the afternoon sunlight. What concerned Ruth most was the texture. It wasn't smooth like a typical allergic reaction, but bumpy, as if something was trying to push up from underneath. "You need to have Dr. Chen look at that," Ruth said firmly. "And don't you dare wait until it gets worse." Sarah spent the next 3 days applying every over-the-counter remedy she could find: hydrocortisone cream, calamine lotion, even the bag balm that James used to swear by for everything from chapped hands to saddle sores. Nothing helped. If anything, the rash seemed to be spreading, creeping outward in irregular tendrils that reminded her uncomfortably of the kudzu vines that had slowly consumed the old tobacco barn behind their property. By Wednesday morning, she could no longer ignore the metallic taste that had developed in her mouth, or the way her dreams had grown vivid and strange. She kept dreaming about James in his army uniform, younger than she'd ever known him, standing in a jungle clearing and warning her about promises they'd been forced to make. In the dreams, he kept pointing to his own neck and saying, "They told us it was safe, Sarah. They promised us it was just like bug spray." Dr. Chen's clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its waiting room filled with the same floral wallpaper and overstuffed furniture that had been there since Doc Patterson's time. Sarah had been coming here for routine checkups for 15 years, long enough to know that Dr. Chen was usually unflappable, the kind of physician who could deliver bad news with compassion and good news with genuine warmth. But something was different the moment she walked into his examining room. Dr. Chen's usual easy smile seemed forced, and his hands shook slightly as he reviewed her chart. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously, "Ruth called ahead and mentioned you had some skin irritation. Why don't you show me what's been bothering you?" When Sarah lifted her hair to reveal the rash, Dr. Chen's reaction was immediate and unsettling. His confident professional demeanor cracked, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition and fear. He leaned in with his magnifying light, studying the affected area with an intensity that made Sarah's stomach clench. "How long did you say you've been experiencing this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "About a week. Maybe less. It started small and just kept growing." Dr. Chen stepped back, removing his gloves with movements that seemed unnecessarily deliberate. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your husband's military service. I know this might seem unrelated, but please bear with me." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "James died 3 years ago. What does that have to do with a rash? What unit was he with in Vietnam? Do you remember any specific locations where he served?" The questions came rapid fire. Had James ever mentioned chemical exposure? Had he participated in any medical studies or experimental treatments? Had Sarah herself ever experienced unusual health issues that doctors couldn't explain? With each question, Dr. Chen's nervousness became more apparent. He kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to interrupt them, and his pen clicked against his clipboard in a rhythm that reminded Sarah of Morse code. "Doctor, you're scaring me," Sarah said finally. "What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Chen sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking much older than his 45 years. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to prescribe a topical steroid cream for now. Apply it twice daily and come back to see me in 1 week. But I want you to promise me something. If this spreads beyond your neck, or if you develop any other symptoms, call me immediately, day or night." He handed her the prescription with hands that Sarah noticed were trembling. As she reached for it, he caught her wrist gently. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time in 15 years of medical care, "sometimes the past has ways of catching up with us. And sometimes the things we think are coincidences aren't." Walking to her car, Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd expected Dr. Chen to dismiss her concerns, to write a simple prescription and send her home with reassurances about middle-aged skin problems. Instead, she felt as if she'd stumbled into the middle of a conversation that had been going on without her for years. That night, she called Maggie for the first time in 2 months. "Mom?" Maggie's voice carried the harried tone of someone pulled away from important work. "Is everything okay? You usually text. I went to see Dr. Chen today about a rash, and he asked me the strangest questions about your father's service record." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. "Maggie, are you there?" "I'm here, Mom. Listen, I want you to take pictures of this rash and send them to me, and I want you to stop using whatever cream Dr. Chen gave you." "Why? What's wrong?" "Maybe nothing. But I've been doing some research lately about Agent Orange effects on veterans' families. There are things the VA hasn't told us, Mom. Things they're still trying to keep quiet." Sarah sank into James's old recliner, the leather worn smooth by 40 years of his presence. "What kind of things?" "The kind that might explain why a simple rash is making a family doctor nervous enough to ask questions about military service from 50 years ago." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of her living room, afraid to turn on the lights and see her reflection in the windows. The steroid cream Dr. Chen had prescribed sat unopened on the kitchen counter, and Maggie's warning echoed in her mind like a prayer she was afraid to finish. Outside, she could see Ruth's kitchen light burning late into the night, and she wondered what secrets her old friend might be carrying, what stories from those field hospital days she'd never shared. In a community built on the foundation of military service and sacrifice, Sarah was beginning to understand that some truths were buried so deep that it took something as simple as a rash to finally bring them to the surface. The photograph Sarah sent to Maggie that Thursday evening changed everything. Within 6 hours, her daughter was standing on the front porch with an overnight bag and the kind of grim determination that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of James when he'd made up his mind about something important. "Mom, we need to talk," Maggie said, not bothering with pleasantries as she pushed past Sarah into the familiar chaos of the living room. Medical journals spilled from her bag as she set it down, and Sarah noticed her daughter's hands shaking as she reached for them. "You drove 2 hours in the middle of the night because of a rash?" Maggie turned to face her mother, and Sarah saw something in her eyes that made her stomach drop. The same look Maggie had worn during James's final hospitalization, when the doctors stopped making eye contact and started talking about comfort measures. "This isn't just a rash, Mom. I showed your photos to 3 dermatologists at the hospital, and none of them have seen anything like it, but Dr. Rodriguez in oncology recognized the pattern." "Oncology?" Sarah's leg suddenly felt unsteady. "Cancer?" "Not cancer. Chemical burns. Specifically the kind caused by prolonged exposure to certain military-grade defoliants." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah sank onto the couch, her mind struggling to process what Maggie was telling her. That's impossible. I was never in the military. I never went to Vietnam. Maggie pulled out a thick folder and spread photographs across the coffee table. Medical images that looked disturbingly similar to what was growing on Sarah's neck. These are from children of veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. Second-generation effects that the VA has been tracking quietly for 20 years but never acknowledged publicly. Sarah stared at the images, each one showing the same irregular spreading pattern of tissue damage. But James died 3 years ago. Why would this be happening now? Because, Maggie said, her voice heavy with the weight of research she'd clearly been conducting for months. The effects aren't always immediate. Sometimes the chemical compounds remain dormant in the body for decades, passed through genetic material or through environmental exposure. And sometimes they're triggered by stress or grief or what? Maggie hesitated, pulling out another folder marked with official-looking stamps. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been in Dad's things lately? Going through his military records or personal effects? Sarah's face flushed. 3 weeks ago, driven by a combination of loneliness and curiosity, she'd finally climbed into the attic to sort through James's footlocker, the one he'd always kept locked and never talked about. She'd found it unlocked for the first time since she'd known him, as if death had finally released whatever secrets he'd been guarding. There were some papers, she admitted. Medical records from when he came back. Some letters from other soldiers. Did you handle them directly without gloves? Of course I did. They were just old papers. Maggie closed her eyes and Sarah saw her daughter's professional composure crack slightly. Mom, some of those documents might have been contaminated. If Dad kept them in sealed containers for 50 years, the chemical residue could still be active. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. James had brought the war home with him in ways neither of them had ever imagined, and now, 3 years after his death, it was trying to claim her too. We need to get you to Richmond, Maggie said, already reaching for her phone. I know a specialist who— No. Sarah's voice was sharper than she'd intended. I'm not going anywhere until I understand what's happening, and I'm certainly not going to become another medical mystery for doctors to poke and prod while they pretend they don't know what's wrong. The argument that followed was one they'd been building toward for 3 years, ever since James's death had left them both raw and angry at a medical system that had failed him so completely. Maggie, trained to trust science and protocols, couldn't understand her mother's reluctance to seek aggressive treatment. Sarah, who had watched her husband deteriorate in sterile hospital rooms while doctors admitted they were learning as they went, couldn't face the prospect of becoming another case study. You can't just ignore this, Mom. It's not going to go away because you pretend it doesn't exist. And rushing to specialists isn't going to bring your father back or undo whatever they did to him over there. The silence that followed was broken by a knock at the front door. Through the window, Sarah could see Dr. Chen's sedan in her driveway, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Did you call him? Sarah asked. Maggie shook her head, looking as surprised as her mother felt. Dr. Chen stood on the porch with the defeated posture of a man carrying too much weight. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled as if he'd been wearing it for days. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, not meeting her eyes, I need to talk to you. About your husband's service record and about some things that happened a long time ago. Sarah led him into the living room where Maggie's medical journals and photographs created an impromptu war room on the coffee table. Dr. Chen's face went pale when he saw the images. You know what this is, Maggie said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Chen sat down heavily, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I was hoping I was wrong. I've been hoping I was wrong for 50 years. What are you talking about? Sarah demanded. Operation Ranch Hand, Dr. Chen said quietly. and the medical studies that followed. Your husband wasn't just exposed to Agent Orange in the field, Mrs. Mitchell. He volunteered for additional exposure as part of a decontamination study when he came home. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. That's impossible. James never mentioned. They were sworn to secrecy. All of them. The men who participated were told it was classified research that could save lives, that they were heroes for volunteering. They were promised medical care for life and compensation for their families if anything went wrong. Dr. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. I was a resident at the time, assigned to monitor the subjects. I was 25 years old and I believed we were doing important work. I believed the senior doctors who told us the exposure levels were safe. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were medical records bearing James's name and service number, documenting weekly chemical exposures that had continued for 6 months after his return from Vietnam. The final page was a death certificate, not James's, but that of another study participant who had died in 1972 of what the report called complications related to chemical exposure. "How many?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 47 men from this area, volunteers from 3 different units. By 1975, 12 of them were dead. The study was terminated, and the records were classified. Sarah stared at the documents, seeing James's careful signature on consent forms that promised compensation and care that never came. "And you've known this for 50 years? I've been providing free medical care to the families ever since. It was all I could do." The classification orders were still in effect, and breaking them would have meant federal prosecution. "But now?" Maggie pressed. Dr. Chen looked directly at Sarah for the first time since entering her house. "Now you're showing symptoms that suggest the contamination was passed to family members through extended contact. This was never supposed to happen. The chemicals were supposed to be metabolized and eliminated within months." Sarah felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper, the foundation of trust that had supported her entire adult life. James knew? He knew he'd been exposed. But the symptoms in family members, this is new. Or at least, it's the first time someone has been brave enough to seek medical attention instead of suffering in silence. The implications hit her like a series of physical blows. Every unexplained illness in their 41 years of marriage, every miscarriage, every strange symptom the doctors had dismissed as stress or age, all of it might have been connected to chemicals James had carried in his body like a slow-acting poison. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Dr. Chen stood up, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked like the young medical resident he'd once been, scared, overwhelmed, but determined to do the right thing regardless of the cost. "Now we break 50 years of silence," he said, "and we hope it's not too late to save the people those chemicals are still killing." The transformation in Sarah's condition over the next month was as dramatic as it was terrifying. What had begun as a quarter-sized irritation had spread across her neck and down her shoulder blade, creating a landscape of inflamed tissue that defied every treatment Dr. Chen attempted. More disturbing were the systemic effects, crushing fatigue that left her unable to climb the stairs to her bedroom, joint pain that made simple tasks like opening jars impossible, and a persistent brain fog that sometimes left her standing in rooms with no memory of why she'd entered them. Maggie had taken a leave of absence from the hospital, officially citing family medical emergency, but privately acknowledging that her involvement in what was becoming a federal investigation had made her position in Richmond untenable. The medical establishment didn't appreciate doctors who asked uncomfortable questions about government-sanctioned chemical testing, especially when those questions implied decades of cover-up and willful negligence. Dr. Chen's confession had triggered a cascade of events that neither Sarah nor Maggie had anticipated. Within days of his disclosure, federal investigators from the Centers for Disease Control arrived in Shenandoah Valley, followed by representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and what appeared to be several agencies that refused to identify themselves clearly. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. Half the town saw Sarah as a hero for finally bringing decades of suppressed truth into the light. The other half viewed her as a traitor who was destroying their quiet way of life for personal gain. Property values plummeted as news of potential chemical contamination spread. Local businesses that depended on tourism watched their bookings evaporate. Families who had lived in the valley for generations suddenly found themselves wondering if the land their children played on was safe. Ruth Williams had become Sarah's closest ally and fiercest protector, but even her support came at a cost. The elderly nurse was facing pressure from neighbors she'd known for 40 years, people who had once brought her casseroles when she was ill and shoveled her driveway after snowstorms. Now they crossed the street to avoid her, and someone had spray-painted "Traitor" on her mailbox in red letters that looked like blood in the evening light. "They're scared," Ruth explained, as she sat in Sarah's kitchen, both women nursing cups of coffee that had grown cold while they watched federal investigators in hazmat suits take soil samples from the backyard. Fear makes people mean, and this whole thing threatens everything they thought they knew about their lives. The investigation had revealed contamination that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The military facility where James and the other volunteers had been exposed had been using local groundwater for cleaning equipment and disposing of chemical waste for over a decade. Wells throughout the valley showed traces of compounds that had been banned since the 1970s, and the contamination appeared to have spread through underground water systems that connected dozens of properties. More families were coming forward, though many did so secretly, afraid of community backlash. Mrs. Garrison, who lived 3 streets over, finally admitted that her husband Bill, another Vietnam veteran, had suffered from a mysterious wasting disease before his death 5 years earlier. The symptoms matched what other study participants had experienced, but Bill had made her promise never to seek medical attention that might lead to questions about his military service. Jennifer Martinez, whose farm bordered the old military facility, brought her teenage son to Dr. Chen after discovering that the boy had been experiencing seizures that no neurologist could explain. Tests revealed elevated levels of the same chemicals found in Sarah's tissue samples, and further investigation showed that Jennifer's well water had been contaminated for over 2 decades. Each new case brought fresh waves of anger and division. Town council meetings became shouting matches between residents who demanded answers and those who insisted the investigation was destroying their community for no good reason. Local businesses organized boycotts against families who cooperated with federal investigators. Children found themselves caught between parents who disagreed about whether the truth was worth the cost of uncovering it. Maggie threw herself into researching similar cases nationwide, building connections with other medical professionals who had encountered unexplained illnesses in military families. Her dining room table became command central, covered with medical journals, legal documents, and correspondence with researchers from universities across the country. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Sarah's case was not unique, but it was part of a pattern of chemical exposure effects that the government had been tracking and suppressing for decades. "There are families in North Carolina showing similar symptoms," Maggie told her mother during one of their late-night strategy sessions, "and in Arkansas and Oregon, all near military facilities that conducted chemical research in the 1960s and 70s. All sworn to secrecy under national security provisions." The most heartbreaking discovery came when they found records of other study participants who had developed symptoms years after the original exposure, but had died before receiving proper diagnosis or treatment. James's friend, Tommy Wilcox, who had died of what doctors called complications from pneumonia in 1993, showed clear signs of chemical-related organ failure in his medical records. Bobby Patterson, who had supposedly died in a farming accident in 1987, had been experiencing the same neurological symptoms that were now affecting Jennifer Martinez's son. Sarah found herself becoming the unwilling face of a movement she had never intended to start. Reporters called daily, asking for interviews about her experience and her husband's involvement in the military studies. Veterans advocacy groups wanted her to speak at rallies and congressional hearings. Lawyers representing other affected families sought her cooperation in class action lawsuits that could take decades to resolve. The physical toll of the contamination was matched by the emotional weight of carrying so many other people's pain. Every new family that came forward added another layer to Sarah's growing understanding of the scope of what had been done to her community. These weren't just medical cases. They were neighbors, friends, people she'd known for decades who had been suffering in silence while she lived obliviously in the same contaminated environment. Dr. Chen's position had become increasingly precarious as his role in the original studies became public knowledge. While many people understood that he had been a young resident following orders, others blamed him for decades of silence about the contamination. His medical practice was hemorrhaging patients, and he'd received death threats from people who blamed him for destroying their property values and their faith in local institutions. "I should have spoken up years ago," he told Sarah during one of her weekly appointments. "I told myself I was protecting people by providing quiet care and keeping the secret, but really I was protecting myself. I was afraid of losing my license, my livelihood, my reputation." The guilt Dr. Chen carried was evident in every interaction, but Sarah found herself feeling more sympathy than anger toward him. He had been trapped by the same system that had silenced James and the other veterans, forced to choose between professional survival and moral obligation. His willingness to finally break that silence, even at great personal cost, had made everything else possible. Meanwhile, Sarah's own health continued to deteriorate in ways that frightened even the federal medical team studying her case. The rash now covered nearly 30% of her body, and blood tests showed systemic inflammation that suggested her immune system was attacking her own tissues. The specialists who flew in from Atlanta and Washington spoke in careful, clinical language about unprecedented presentations and unique exposure pathways, but Sarah could see the concern in their eyes. The experimental treatments they proposed carried significant risks, and some required her to travel to specialized facilities far from home. Each option meant leaving behind the community fight she had started, abandoning the other families who were looking to her for leadership and hope. But staying meant watching her body continue to break down while the contamination spread deeper into her system. As autumn settled over Shenandoah Valley, painting the mountains in brilliant shades of red and gold, Sarah faced the hardest decision of her life. The investigation had taken on a momentum of its own, with federal agencies, congressional committees, and media attention that extended far beyond anything she had imagined when she first noticed that small rash behind her neck. The truth was finally coming to light, but the cost of illumination was proving higher than anyone had anticipated. The emergency room at Richmond General at 2:47 a.m. was not where Sarah had planned to spend her 63rd birthday, but her body had made that decision for her. What began as difficulty breathing during dinner with Maggie had escalated into full respiratory distress by the time the ambulance reached the hospital. The rash that had started as a small irritation 6 months earlier now covered 60% of her body, and her organs were beginning to shut down from what doctors were calling systemic chemical toxicity syndrome. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the CDC specialist who had been monitoring Sarah's case, arrived within hours of the emergency admission. A stern woman in her 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Dr. Valdez had spent her career studying environmental health disasters, but she admitted privately to Maggie that Sarah's case was unlike anything in the medical literature. The chemical compounds in her system are attacking her body at the cellular level, Dr. Valdez explained as they stood outside Sarah's ICU room. It's as if decades of exposure have suddenly become active, overwhelming her immune system's ability to cope. Maggie stared through the glass at her mother, who lay unconscious, surrounded by machines that monitored every aspect of her failing body. What are her chances? With conventional treatment, very poor. The contamination is too extensive and too deeply embedded in her tissues. Dr. Valdez paused, choosing her words carefully. But there may be an experimental option. The treatment Dr. Valdez proposed was as controversial as it was untested. A team at Johns Hopkins had developed a protocol for treating severe chemical exposure using a combination of chelation therapy, immunosuppressants, and what amounted to medically induced coma while the body's systems were artificially supported. Only 3 patients had undergone the procedure with mixed results. The risks are enormous, Dr. Valdez warned. We would essentially be shutting down her immune system completely and rebuilding it from scratch. She could die from any infection, any complication, and even if she survives, we don't know what the long-term effects might be. But as Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate over the next 48 hours, it became clear that conventional medicine had nothing left to offer. Her kidneys were failing, her liver function was declining rapidly, and the chemical burns were spreading to internal organs. Without intervention, Dr. Valdez estimated that Sarah had perhaps a week to live. The decision to proceed with the experimental treatment brought the entire investigation to a crucial moment. Sarah had become the symbol of decades of government cover-up and medical neglect, and her death would represent not just personal tragedy, but the failure of the system to protect the very people it had endangered. Media attention intensified as news of her critical condition spread, with protesters gathering outside the hospital demanding accountability and justice. Ruth Williams, despite her own 89 years and failing health, took charge of organizing community support for Sarah's family. She coordinated meal deliveries for Maggie, managed the flood of phone calls from reporters and advocates, and somehow found time to sit at Sarah's bedside during visiting hours, reading aloud from the same books Sarah had once taught to reluctant high school students. She always loved Frost, Ruth told Maggie during one of these vigils, said his poems reminded her that even the darkest woods had paths through them. Dr. Chen had become a pariah in his own community, but he visited Sarah daily, carrying the weight of guilt for his role in the original experiments that had led to this moment. His medical practice had collapsed, and he was facing federal charges for his part in the cover-up, but he seemed determined to see Sarah's case through to whatever end awaited. "This is my fault," he told Maggie during one of these visits. "All of it. If I had spoken up 50 years ago, if I had refused to participate in those studies, if I had broken my silence when the first veterans started getting sick—" "You can't carry all of that," Maggie interrupted. "The system was bigger than any one doctor, any one decision. What matters now is what we do going forward." The experimental treatment began on a cold November morning, with Sarah surrounded by a team of specialists who had flown in from medical centers across the country. The procedure itself would take place over several weeks, with Sarah's body functions supported by machines, while the chelation therapy worked to remove chemical contaminants from her system. The first phase involved inducing a medical coma that would allow the treatment team to control every aspect of Sarah's physiology. Maggie held her mother's hand as the anesthesia took effect, whispering promises that she would fight to continue the investigation no matter what happened. "We're going to finish what you started, Mom. We're going to make sure this never happens to another family." The community's reaction to Sarah's critical condition was as divided as everything else had been since the investigation began. Supporters organized prayer vigils and fundraising campaigns to help with medical expenses. Opponents muttered that she was getting what she deserved for stirring up trouble and destroying their peaceful way of life. But something unexpected began happening as news of Sarah's fight for life spread beyond Shenandoah Valley. Veterans' families from across the country started reaching out, sharing their own stories of mysterious illnesses and unexplained deaths that might be connected to chemical exposure. What had begun as one woman's search for answers to a strange rash was becoming a national conversation about medical ethics, government accountability, and the true cost of military service. Congressional hearings were scheduled, with legislators demanding answers about the scope of chemical testing on military personnel and their families. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced a comprehensive review of health claims related to Agent Orange and other chemical exposures. Most significantly, the Department of Defense agreed to declassify documents related to Operation Ranch Hand and associated medical studies, potentially affecting thousands of veterans and their families. Ruth Williams found herself in the unexpected position of community spokesperson, fielding calls from national media outlets and advocacy groups who wanted to understand what was happening in their small Virginia town. Despite her advanced age and her own health concerns, she proved to be a formidable advocate for Sarah and the other affected families. "This isn't about politics or money," she told a reporter from the Washington Post. "This is about people who served their country and were betrayed by the very government they trusted with their lives. This is about families who suffered in silence for 50 years because they were told their pain didn't matter." As Sarah lay unconscious in the ICU, her body fighting a battle that would determine not just her survival, but the future of the investigation she had started, the first phase of the experimental treatment showed promising signs. Her organ function stabilized and blood tests indicated that the chelation therapy was successfully removing chemical contaminants from her system. But Dr. Valdez warned against premature optimism. The most dangerous phase was yet to come, rebuilding Sarah's immune system while protecting her from the infections and complications that had killed other patients who had undergone similar treatments. Every day brought new challenges, new decisions about medications and procedures that could either save her life or end it. Maggie took to sleeping in the hospital waiting room, maintaining a constant vigil that reminded older nurses of the military families who had waited through previous wars. She used the time to continue her research, building an ever-expanding database of similar cases and connecting with medical professionals who were studying the long-term effects of chemical exposure. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that Sarah, who had spent her career teaching literature and helping students find meaning in complex texts, had become the central character in a story that was rewriting the official narrative of American military history. Her body had become the evidence that decades of official denials could no longer suppress, and her survival or death would determine whether that evidence would lead to justice or simply become another tragic footnote in the long history of government cover-ups. As November turned to December, with winter settling over the Shenandoah Valley and Sarah still fighting for her life in a Richmond hospital room, the investigation that had begun with a simple rash had grown into something none of them could have imagined. The truth was finally emerging, but whether it was emerging in time to save the woman who had made it possible remained an open question. Dr. Chen's heart attack came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in December, just as Sarah was entering the most critical phase of her experimental treatment. Maggie received the call from Richmond General's emergency department while she dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside her mother's ICU bed, and the news hit her like a physical blow, not just because of the personal loss, but because of what Dr. Chen's death might mean for the investigation that had consumed all their lives. The physician who had carried 50 years of guilt about his role in the chemical experiments died clutching a manila envelope that contained what investigators would later call the smoking gun. Complete medical records from Operation Ranch Hand, including documentation of cover-up orders, lists of all study participants, and evidence of systematic destruction of medical files that might have helped affected veterans receive proper care decades earlier. Ruth Williams, despite her own failing health and the community pressure she faced daily, took charge of Dr. Chen's funeral arrangements when his estranged family refused to return to Shenandoah Valley. The service was held at Calvary Baptist, the same church where Sarah had first noticed the rash that had started everything, and the division within the community was evident even in death. Half the pews remained empty while protesters gathered outside with signs calling Dr. Chen a traitor and demanding an end to the federal investigation. "He was a good man who made a terrible choice when he was young," Ruth said during the eulogy she insisted on delivering herself. "And he spent 50 years trying to make amends for that choice. We should all be so brave when it comes time to face our own mistakes." But Dr. Chen's death created a cascade of problems that threatened to derail everything Sarah had fought for. As the only surviving medical professional who had direct knowledge of the original experiments, his testimony had been crucial to establishing the legal foundation for compensation claims and criminal prosecutions. Without him, federal prosecutors worried that they might not have enough evidence to pursue charges against the military officials and pharmaceutical companies that had knowingly exposed veterans to dangerous chemicals. More immediately, Dr. Chen's death left the community without a physician who understood the complex medical needs of families affected by the contamination. The replacement doctor sent by the county health department was a young resident who had no experience with chemical exposure cases and seemed overwhelmed by the political complexities of treating patients in a community torn apart by federal investigation. Sarah's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse in the days following Dr. Chen's funeral. The experimental treatment that had shown such promise in its early stages suddenly began producing complications that baffled even the specialists who had developed the protocol. Her immune system, suppressed to allow for chemical chelation, was not rebuilding as expected, leaving her vulnerable to infections that her body couldn't fight. "It's as if her system is rejecting the treatment," Dr. Valdez explained to Maggie during one of their increasingly frequent crisis conferences. "We've never seen this type of immune response before. It's possible that the chemical contamination is so extensive that her body can't distinguish between the chelation agents and the original toxins." The failure of the experimental treatment represented more than just medical setback. It symbolized the systemic failure of institutions to protect the people they were supposed to serve. Sarah had trusted her government, her medical system, and her community to keep her safe, and each had failed her in fundamental ways. Now, even the cutting-edge medicine that represented the best hope for chemical exposure victims was proving inadequate to undo decades of damage. Maggie found herself making decisions that no daughter should have to make. Weighing her mother's suffering against the slim possibility of recovery, balancing Sarah's role as a symbol of justice against her basic human need for dignity and peace. The media attention that had brought national focus to the chemical testing scandal now felt invasive and exploitative, turning Sarah's dying into a public spectacle that served political purposes she had never intended. The community's reaction to Sarah's deteriorating condition revealed the deep moral complexity of the situation they all faced. Even some of her harshest critics found themselves praying for her recovery, recognizing that her death would bring a level of media scrutiny and federal intervention that could destroy what remained of their way of life. Others saw her suffering as divine justice for disturbing secrets that were better left buried. Jennifer Martinez, whose teenage son had been diagnosed with neurological damage from the same contamination affecting Sarah, organized prayer vigils that brought together families from across the valley who had been touched by the chemical exposure. These gatherings became informal support groups where people shared stories they had kept secret for decades: miscarriages, birth defects, mysterious illnesses, and premature deaths that suddenly made sense in the context of widespread environmental contamination. "My grandmother always said this valley was cursed," Jennifer told the group during one particularly emotional session. "She said the land remembered the pain that had been inflicted on it. I thought she was just being superstitious, but maybe she understood something we're only now learning." Ruth Williams had become the unofficial keeper of community memory, collecting testimonies from families who were finally ready to break their silence about the health problems they had endured. Her dining room table was covered with handwritten statements, medical records, and photographs that documented decades of suffering that had been dismissed or ignored by medical professionals who either didn't know or didn't want to know about the chemical contamination. "The truth has a weight to it," Ruth told a reporter from 60 Minutes, who had come to document the community's struggle. "You can bury it for a while, but eventually it becomes too heavy to keep underground." Sarah's illness is just the truth finally breaking through. The federal investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had anticipated, with teams from multiple agencies working to identify other communities that might have been affected by similar chemical testing programs. What they discovered was a pattern of experimentation that extended across decades and involved thousands of military personnel and their families who had never been informed about their exposure or the potential long-term health consequences. Congressional hearings were being planned, with legislators from both parties expressing outrage about the scope of the cover-up and demanding accountability from military and medical officials who had participated in or concealed evidence of the chemical testing programs. But Sarah, who had become the face of this national scandal, was too sick to participate in the justice she had helped make possible. The experimental treatment entered its final phase in late December, with doctors attempting one last intervention that carried enormous risk but represented Sarah's only chance for survival. The procedure involved essentially rebuilding her immune system using stem cells, while her body was supported by machines that performed the functions her organs could no longer manage independently. Maggie signed the consent forms with hands that shook from exhaustion and grief, knowing that she was potentially authorizing either her mother's salvation or her death. The medical team was honest about the odds: less than 20% chance of survival, and even lower odds of meaningful recovery if Sarah did survive the initial procedure. "She's fighting for more than just herself now," Dr. Valdez told Maggie as they prepared for the final intervention. "Her case has opened doors that were sealed for 50 years. Whatever happens, her courage has already saved lives and will continue to save lives long after this is over." But for Maggie, watching her mother's body fail despite the best efforts of modern medicine, the broader implications felt secondary to the simple, devastating reality that she was about to lose the most important person in her life. Sarah had spent her career teaching students about the power of individual actions to create meaningful change, but the cost of her own heroism was proving higher than either of them had imagined. As 2023 drew to a close, with Sarah clinging to life in a Richmond hospital room and the investigation she had started reverberating through the halls of power in Washington, the community of Shenandoah Valley faced an uncertain future. The truth about decades of chemical contamination was finally emerging, but whether that truth would bring justice or simply more pain remained to be seen. The woman who had noticed a simple rash and refused to ignore it had changed everything, but whether she would live to see the results of that change was a question that hung over everyone like a prayer they were afraid to finish. Ruth Williams died quietly in her sleep on New Year's Eve, just hours before Sarah's final experimental treatment was scheduled to begin. The 89-year-old former Navy nurse had spent her last weeks organizing the community testimonies that would become crucial evidence in the federal investigation, but she had also been hiding her own deteriorating health from everyone who depended on her strength and wisdom. Maggie discovered Ruth's body when she went to check on her before heading to the hospital for Sarah's procedure. The elderly woman was sitting peacefully in her favorite armchair, surrounded by boxes of carefully organized documents and photographs that told the story of 50 years of medical cover-up and community suffering. In her lap was a letter addressed to Sarah, sealed but never delivered. The letter, which Maggie read through tears in the hospital waiting room, contained revelations that changed everything they thought they knew about the chemical contamination and Dr. Chen's role in the cover-up. Ruth had not just been a concerned neighbor and retired nurse. She had been a participant observer in the original medical experiments, assigned to monitor the health of study participants' families as part of a classified research protocol that extended far beyond what anyone had previously understood. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I have carried this secret for 70 years, and I cannot take it to my grave knowing that you are dying from the very contamination I helped document but was forbidden to reveal. The chemical exposure did not end with the men who volunteered for those studies. It was deliberately extended to their families through what the military called environmental persistence monitoring. They wanted to know how the chemicals would affect wives and children through secondary exposure, and they used us as unwitting test subjects." The letter detailed how Ruth had been recruited in 1953, fresh out of nursing school and eager to serve her country, to participate in what was described as family health monitoring for veterans who had been exposed to experimental defoliants. She was told she was helping to ensure the safety of military families, but she gradually realized she was actually documenting the effects of ongoing chemical exposure that was being deliberately maintained through contaminated household items, medical supplies, and even the veterans' clothing and personal effects. They gave the men special soap, toothpaste, and shaving cream to take home, Ruth had written. They told the veterans these were decontamination supplies that would protect their families. But I learned later that these products actually contained low levels of the same chemicals they had been exposed to in the field. They wanted to study multi-generational effects, and they were willing to poison entire families to get their data. The implications of Ruth's revelation were staggering. What they had believed was secondary contamination from James's military service was actually deliberate, systematic exposure that had been maintained for decades through products that were supposed to protect military families. The rash on Sarah's neck wasn't just the result of handling contaminated documents. It was the culmination of a lifetime of exposure to chemicals that had been deliberately introduced into her household through her husband's military-issued personal care items. Maggie immediately contacted Dr. Valdez with Ruth's letter, and within hours, federal investigators were searching through the evidence Ruth had meticulously preserved in her home. What they found corroborated every detail of her account and provided documentation of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the original Operation Ranch Hand experiments. Thousands of military families had been unknowingly exposed to chemical agents through a program that had continued well into the 1980s. "This changes everything," Dr. Valdez told Maggie as they prepared for Sarah's final treatment. "Your mother isn't just a victim of secondary exposure, she's been a test subject her entire adult life. The chemicals in her system aren't just from recent contact with your father's documents. They've been accumulating in her body for over 40 years. The discovery explained why Sarah's case had been so severe and why the experimental treatment had failed to produce the expected results. Her body wasn't rejecting the chelation therapy, it was responding to the removal of chemicals that had become integrated into her cellular structure over decades of exposure. The treatment protocol designed for acute contamination was inadequate for someone who had been systematically poisoned for most of her adult life. But Ruth's revelations also provided hope. Hidden among her documents were research notes from military physicians who had studied the long-term effects of the family contamination program. These notes included treatment protocols that had never been shared with civilian medical professionals, approaches to chemical removal that were specifically designed for multi-generational exposure cases like Sarah's. Dr. Valdez worked through the night with specialists from Walter Reed Medical Center and the CDC to develop a modified treatment plan based on Ruth's documentation. The new protocol was even more experimental than what they had already attempted, but it offered the first real hope for addressing the type of systemic contamination that Sarah's body harbored. The timing was crucial. Sarah's condition had deteriorated to the point where she had perhaps hours before multiple organ failure would make any intervention impossible. The modified treatment would require emergency approval from multiple federal agencies and medical ethics boards. But Dr. Valdez's connections in the military medical community allowed her to bypass normal protocols under emergency provisions designed for cases involving classified medical research. As dawn broke on January 1, 2024, Sarah was wheeled into surgery for a procedure that had never been attempted on a civilian patient. The treatment involved not just chemical chelation, but also genetic therapy designed to repair cellular damage at the molecular level. Military physicians who had developed these techniques for treating soldiers exposed to chemical weapons flew in from research facilities across the country to participate in what was essentially an experimental surgery being performed to save one woman's life and potentially revolutionize treatment for thousands of others. Maggie spent New Year's Day in the surgical waiting room, surrounded by federal investigators, military medical researchers, and reporters who had somehow learned about the emergency procedure. The irony was not lost on her that her mother, who had simply wanted to understand a strange rash, had become the subject of the most advanced medical intervention in the history of chemical exposure treatment. The surgery lasted 14 hours, with updates provided every few hours by members of the surgical team who looked increasingly exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Sarah's body was responding to the modified treatment in ways that surprised even the physicians who had developed the protocols. The genetic therapy appeared to be reversing decades of cellular damage, while the advanced chelation process was removing chemical compounds that had been embedded in her tissues since the 1970s. But the real breakthrough came when pathologists analyzing tissue samples from Sarah's surgery discovered something that changed their understanding of the entire contamination program. The chemicals in her system weren't just industrial defoliants, they included experimental compounds that had never been used in Vietnam or any other military theater. These substances appeared to be synthetic variants designed specifically for long-term biological research on human subjects. They weren't just studying the effects of Agent Orange, Dr. Valdez explained to Maggie during one of their updates. They were developing new chemical agents and using military families as test subjects to evaluate their long-term effects. Your mother has been carrying evidence of war crimes in her body for 40 years. The revelation transformed Sarah's case from medical emergency to international incident. The chemicals found in her system provided proof of biological weapons research that violated multiple international treaties, and her successful treatment offered hope for victims of chemical weapons attacks worldwide. What had begun as one woman's quest for answers about a mysterious rash had uncovered evidence of systematic human experimentation that extended far beyond anything previously documented. As Sarah slowly emerged from the medically induced coma that had sustained her through the experimental treatment, the world she was waking up to was fundamentally different from the one she had left behind. Ruth Williams was gone, taking with her decades of secrets, but leaving behind evidence that would reshape how the world understood the true cost of military service and the lengths to which governments would go to protect their darkest secrets. The truth that Sarah had fought so hard to uncover was finally emerging. But the price of that truth, measured in lives lost, families destroyed, and communities torn apart, was higher than anyone had imagined when she first noticed that small, persistent rash behind her neck. Sarah's eyes opened on a Tuesday morning in March, nearly 3 months after the experimental surgery that had saved her life. The first thing she saw was Maggie's face, thinner than she remembered but radiant with a joy that seemed to illuminate the entire hospital room. The second thing she noticed was the absence of pain. For the first time in over a year, her body felt like it belonged to her again. "Welcome back, Mom," Maggie whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she took Sarah's hand. "We have so much to tell you." The world Sarah woke up to was transformed in ways that defied her ability to comprehend them all at once. The experimental treatment had not only saved her life, but had provided medical researchers with breakthrough insights into treating chemical exposure that were already being used to help veterans and their families across the country. The protocols developed during her surgery had been shared with medical centers internationally, offering new hope for victims of chemical weapons and industrial contamination worldwide. But the personal cost of her recovery was immediately apparent. Ruth Williams was gone, and with her death, Sarah had lost not just a dear friend but the woman who had been the secret guardian of truth for an entire community. The revelation of Ruth's role in documenting the family contamination program had reframed everything they thought they knew about the chemical exposure. But it had also revealed the depth of deception that had shaped Sarah's entire adult life. "She left you something," Maggie said, pulling out a small wooden box that Ruth had specified should be given to Sarah only after her recovery. Inside was a collection of photographs spanning 5 decades, pictures of Sarah and James at various stages of their marriage, but also medical documents and correspondence that showed Ruth had been quietly monitoring their health and documenting symptoms that no one else would acknowledge or treat. The photographs told a story of love and loss that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Ruth had captured moments of happiness, Sarah and James dancing at their anniversary parties, working in their garden, celebrating Maggie's graduation from medical school. But she had also documented the gradual decline that chemical contamination had brought to their lives. James's increasing fatigue, Sarah's recurring mysterious illnesses, the miscarriages they had never spoken about publicly, all of it had been witnessed and recorded by a woman who knew the truth but was bound by military secrecy orders to remain silent. "She loved you like a daughter," Maggie explained as Sarah examined the photographs with wonder and grief. "But she also knew that someday the truth would have to come out, and she wanted to make sure there was evidence to support it when that day arrived." The legal implications of Ruth's documentation were staggering. Federal prosecutors had filed criminal charges against 14 former military and pharmaceutical officials who had participated in the family contamination program. Congressional hearings had been scheduled for the summer, with Sarah invited to testify about her experience as a witness to what legislators were calling the most extensive violation of medical ethics in American military history. More importantly for Sarah's immediate concerns, the Department of Veterans Affairs had announced a comprehensive compensation program for families affected by the chemical testing programs. The financial settlement would not only cover all of Sarah's medical expenses, but would provide security for her and Maggie for the rest of their lives. Similar compensation was being offered to the hundreds of other families who had been unknowingly exposed to experimental chemicals through the Contaminated Products Program. The community of Shenandoah Valley had undergone its own transformation during Sarah's recovery. The initial division and anger that had characterized the early stages of the investigation had gradually given way to a collective understanding that the truth, however painful, was necessary for healing. Property values had stabilized as federal cleanup efforts removed contaminated soil and groundwater from affected areas. New businesses had moved into the valley, drawn by the research center that had been established to study long-term effects of chemical exposure. Dr. Chen's death had initially seemed like it would derail the investigation, but his final documentation had actually strengthened the case against the officials who had designed and implemented the family contamination program. A memorial had been erected in the town square honoring both Dr. Chen and Ruth Williams as guardians of truth who sacrificed their own peace to protect their community. The inscription, suggested by Sarah from her hospital bed, read, "They carried the weight of secrets so that others might find the strength of truth." Jennifer Martinez had become an unexpected community leader, organizing support groups for affected families and working with federal agencies to ensure that cleanup efforts addressed all sources of contamination. Her teenage son, whose neurological symptoms had initially seemed so frightening, was responding well to treatments developed based on Sarah's case and was expected to make a full recovery. "It's like the whole valley is healing," Jennifer told Sarah during one of her first visits after awakening from the coma. "Not just from the chemicals, but from the silence. People are talking to each other again, sharing stories they've kept hidden for decades. We're becoming the community we always could have been if we hadn't been afraid of the truth." The medical breakthrough that Sarah's case had provided extended far beyond the immediate community. The treatment protocols developed during her surgery were being used to help veterans from multiple conflicts who had been exposed to various chemical agents. International medical organizations were adapting the techniques for victims of chemical weapons attacks in Syria and other conflict zones. Sarah's suffering had become the foundation for healing that would help thousands of people she would never meet. But perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah's relationship with Maggie. The months of fighting for her mother's life had brought them closer than they had been since Maggie was a child. Working together to understand the contamination and its effects had given them a shared purpose that transcended their previous disagreements about independence and family obligation. "I understand now why you were so reluctant to trust the medical system," Maggie told her mother as they walked slowly through the hospital corridors during Sarah's physical therapy sessions. "You knew, on some level, that the institutions we're supposed to trust had already betrayed you once. Your instincts were protecting you from further harm." The experimental treatment had left Sarah physically transformed in ways that went beyond simply removing chemical contamination from her system. The genetic therapy had actually reversed some of the aging effects that the chemicals had accelerated, giving her energy and vitality that she hadn't experienced in years. Her hair had grown back thicker and healthier than before, and the chronic joint pain that she had attributed to normal aging had completely disappeared. "It's like I've been given a second chance at life," Sarah told Dr. Valdez during one of her follow-up appointments. "Not just to survive, but to live fully in a way I haven't been able to for years." The media attention that had initially felt overwhelming had evolved into something more meaningful. Sarah had become a spokesperson for medical ethics and patient rights, traveling to universities and medical conferences to share her story with healthcare professionals who were learning about the importance of questioning authority and advocating for their patients. Her message was simple but powerful. Trust your instincts, ask uncomfortable questions, and never accept that suffering is normal when it might be preventable. As spring returned to Shenandoah Valley, Sarah found herself standing in the garden behind her house, the same garden where she and James had spent countless hours, where Ruth had grown her victory vegetables, where evidence of chemical contamination had first been discovered in the soil. The federal cleanup had removed the contaminated earth and replaced it with clean soil, and Sarah was planting flowers for the first time in years. The rash that had started everything was completely gone, leaving only the faintest trace of scarring that served as a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But the investigation it had sparked had saved not just her life, but the lives and health of countless others who had been suffering in silence for decades. James's memory felt different now, not diminished by the knowledge of how he had been used by his government, but enhanced by understanding the courage it had taken for him to live with secrets that must have been enormously painful to carry. She could finally grieve for him properly, understanding that he had been both a hero who served his country and a victim who had been betrayed by the very institutions he had trusted with his life. 1 year later, Sarah stood before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, her voice steady and clear as she delivered testimony that would reshape how America cares for its military families. The woman who had once been afraid to question a simple rash was now fearlessly confronting senators and generals about decades of medical cover-ups and chemical contamination that had affected thousands of veterans and their loved ones. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, her words carrying the weight of personal tragedy transformed into national purpose. "I am the widow of Army Specialist James Mitchell, who served his country with honor in Vietnam and unknowingly brought home chemical contamination that nearly killed me 43 years later. I am here today not just as a survivor, but as a voice for the thousands of military families who have suffered in silence, who have been told their symptoms were imaginary, who have died without ever knowing that their government failed to protect them from the very chemicals they were exposed to in service to their country." The hearing room was packed with veterans, family members, and advocates who had traveled from across the nation to witness this moment of accountability. In the front row sat Maggie, now serving as the director of the new Center for Chemical Exposure Research that had been established with federal funding at Virginia Commonwealth University. Beside her was Jennifer Martinez, whose son had made a complete recovery and was now studying environmental science at Virginia Tech, determined to prevent future contamination disasters. The senators who questioned Sarah that day represented both political parties, but their questions reflected a rare bipartisan commitment to addressing the systemic failures that had allowed the family contamination program to operate in secret for over 3 decades. Senator Patricia Williams, the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee, had lost her own father to Agent Orange-related illness and brought a personal understanding to the hearings that transcended political considerations. "Mrs. Mitchell," Senator Williams asked, "what do you want to see come from these hearings? What would justice look like for the families who have been affected by these programs?" Sarah's answer had been carefully prepared, but it came from her heart rather than any script. "Justice, Senator, would be ensuring that no military family ever again has to choose between trusting their government and protecting their health. Justice would be transparency in medical research involving service members and their families. Justice would be comprehensive health care for all victims of chemical exposure, regardless of when or how that exposure occurred. And justice would be a promise that when our soldiers come home from serving their country, they bring only their courage and sacrifice with them, not chemical weapons that will slowly kill the people they love most." The applause that followed was unlike anything typically heard in a Senate hearing room, sustained, emotional, and filled with the recognition that they were witnessing a turning point in how America treats its veterans and their families. Sarah felt the presence of James, of Ruth Williams, of Dr. Chen, and of all the families who had suffered in silence for so many years. Their pain had not been meaningless. It had been the foundation for change that would protect future generations. Following her testimony, Sarah was approached by representatives from veterans organizations, medical research institutions, and families who had only recently learned that their own mysterious health problems might be connected to chemical contamination. Each conversation reinforced her understanding that her personal journey from a simple rash to national advocacy had opened doors that could never be closed again. The legislation that emerged from the hearings was comprehensive and far-reaching. The Veterans Chemical Exposure Accountability Act provided funding for medical research, established new protocols for informed consent in military medical studies, and created a compensation fund that would provide lifetime health care for affected families. Perhaps most importantly, it declassified thousands of documents related to chemical testing programs and established an independent oversight board to prevent future secret medical experiments on military personnel. But for Sarah, the most meaningful outcome was personal. The Shenandoah Valley had been transformed from a community divided by secrets into a place where truth and healing were possible. The research center that bore Ruth Williams's name was attracting scientists and medical professionals from around the world, studying not just chemical exposure, but the broader question of how communities can recover from systematic deception and abuse. The house that Sarah and James had built together had been completely remediated, its contaminated materials replaced with clean construction that would never again harbor chemical toxins. Sarah had chosen to stay, partly because the valley was her home, but also because leaving would have felt like abandoning the work that remained to be done. Every day brought new families seeking help, new research projects that built on the breakthrough treatments developed during her illness, new opportunities to turn suffering into service. Maggie had moved back to Shenandoah Valley, bringing her medical expertise to the growing community of researchers and advocates who had made the valley their base of operations. Mother and daughter now worked together in ways they had never imagined possible, their relationship strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect for the courage each had shown during the darkest days of Sarah's illness. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had just ignored that rash," Sarah told Maggie during one of their evening walks through the valley that had become synonymous with environmental justice and medical ethics. "If I had just accepted Dr. Chen's first diagnosis and never asked questions." "But you didn't ignore it," Maggie replied. "You trusted your instincts and you fought for answers, even when everyone around you was telling you to be quiet and accept what you were given. That's what heroes do, Mom. They ask the questions that other people are afraid to ask." The memorial garden that had been planted where Ruth Williams's house once stood had become a place of pilgrimage for families affected by chemical contamination. Each stone in the garden's pathways bore the name of a veteran or family member who had suffered from exposure-related illness, and new stones were added monthly as more families came forward with their stories. Sarah tended the garden personally, finding peace in the rhythm of seasonal planting and the knowledge that beauty could grow from even the darkest soil. The experimental treatment that had saved Sarah's life had been refined and standardized, becoming the protocol for treating severe chemical exposure at medical centers across the country. The success rate had improved dramatically as doctors learned from her case, and hundreds of veterans and their family members had received life-saving care based on the breakthrough that her suffering had made possible. Dr. Valdez, who had led Sarah's medical team, had established a fellowship program that trained young physicians in the complex medical and ethical issues surrounding chemical exposure. The program required fellows to spend time in affected communities like Shenandoah Valley, learning not just the medical aspects of treatment, but the human cost of institutional secrecy and the importance of patient advocacy. Medical science advances through individual cases that reveal broader truths, Dr. Valdez told the first class of fellows during their orientation in the valley. But it's important to remember that behind every breakthrough is a human being who chose courage over comfort, truth over safety. Sarah Mitchell could have quietly accepted her diagnosis and died without ever knowing what had really happened to her and her family. Instead, she chose to fight, and that choice has saved thousands of lives. As autumn returned to Shenandoah Valley, painting the mountains in the brilliant colors that had drawn settlers to the region for centuries, Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple rash and had led to national legislation, medical breakthroughs, and personal transformation that she could never have imagined. The woman who had once been afraid to question her doctor's diagnosis was now a nationally recognized advocate who spoke truth to power in the halls of Congress and the boardrooms of pharmaceutical companies. The speaking engagements had become a regular part of Sarah's life, taking her to universities, medical conferences, and veterans gatherings across the country. Each audience brought new perspectives and new challenges, but the core message remained constant. Trust your instincts, ask hard questions, and never accept that suffering is inevitable when it might be preventable. But perhaps the most important work happened in quieter moments. The phone calls from families who had just received diagnoses they didn't understand, the letters from veterans who were finally ready to seek help for symptoms they had hidden for decades, the conversations with young doctors who were learning that healing requires not just medical knowledge but moral courage. Sarah's story had become larger than her individual experience, growing into a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept extraordinary injustice. The rash that had nearly killed her had become the key that unlocked decades of secrets and opened pathways to healing that extended far beyond her own recovery. As she prepared for bed in the house that had been both her sanctuary and her battleground, Sarah looked out at the valley lights twinkling in the darkness. Each light represented a family, a story, a life that had been touched by the truth that her courage had helped reveal. The pain of the past would never be completely erased, but it had been transformed into purpose that would outlive her own life and continue protecting future generations. The woman who had simply wanted to understand a strange rash had learned that sometimes the smallest questions lead to the largest answers. And that individual courage sustained over time can move mountains, even mountains of institutional secrecy that have stood for decades. Her legacy would not be measured in the suffering she had endured, but in the healing she had made possible for countless others who would never again have to suffer in silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking help, new opportunities to turn past pain into present purpose. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell slept peacefully in a house that was finally free of contamination, in a community that was finally free of secrets, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary people can accomplish the most extraordinary things simply by refusing to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. A message of hope and courage for our generation. Dear friends, Sarah's story reminds us that at any stage of life we have the power to ask the questions that matter, to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right, and to fight for truth even when it's uncomfortable. Whether it's a medical concern, a family issue, or something affecting our community, we've earned the wisdom and courage to demand answers and accountability. Sarah was just an ordinary retired teacher who noticed a rash, but her refusal to accept easy explanations saved thousands of lives and changed history. Our generation has lived through enough to know when something isn't right, and we have the strength and experience to do something about it. Every day offers us the chance to be heroes in our own families and communities, simply by asking the hard questions and refusing to stay silent when we witness injustice. What small thing in your life have you been ignoring that might be worth investigating further? Have you ever had an instinct about something that others dismissed but you now wish you had pursued?